Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. I'm your Bible teacher, Pastor B.E.Winship. Today's program comes as by a request of a listener. In fact, down through the years, I've received many requests from listeners who have wanted me to do a program about the Federal Reserve. Now, I imagine that many do not have hard and fast opinions. They just want to know whether these conspiracy theories are true or false. But I'm sure others have already made up their mind, and they just want me to expose the Federal Reserve as some sort of evil cabal of money changers who control the world. But there are people on the political right and the political left who see the Federal Reserve as the boogeyman in America, the shadow government. All sorts of books and articles and videos are out there excoriating the Federal Reserve, these powerful world bankers, as if this is the source of all of America's problems. They even claim that World War I and World War II are the result of the Federal Reserve. So as far as conspiracy theories, the Federal Reserve is right up there with the Bilderbergers and the Rothschilds and the Illuminati and the Council for Foreign Relations. So today I'm going to try and give you a fair and balanced approach to a very complicated subject. Most people don't understand economics and monetary policy, so this can be quite difficult. But the bottom line is not that the Federal Reserve is so great, but the alternatives are just as problematic, if not worse. What I think is going on here is that the problems people have with the Federal Reserve are the problems built into this fallen world system, where everything is passing away. 1 John 2:17, the world is passing away and the lust thereof. Nothing has intrinsic value, not even gold. And whether we like it or not, we need bankers to police our economic system. So first, what is the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve is a semi-private, semi-government agency that's in charge of our currency. It is in effect our national bank. You'll notice that in every bill you have in your wallet, it doesn't say American currency, it says Federal Reserve note. Back in 1913, President Wilson and the Congress passed the Glass-Owens bill, creating the Federal Reserve. The Fed consists of 12 regional banks or departments, each in charge of a different region of the United States. Those 12 banks have boards of directors from the private sector, and over the entire 12-bank system is the Board of Governors. And these governors are appointed by the president and they're confirmed by the Senate for a 14-year term. The current head of the Federal Reserve is Jerome Powell. Before him was Janet Yellen. Before her was Ben Bernanke, then Alan Greenspan, then Paul Volcker. All very familiar names. Now, those who ideologically object to the Federal Reserve System state that the Constitution only authorizes Congress to coin money, not this private entity called the Federal Reserve. Article 1, Section 8.5 of our Constitution, the Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weight and measures. And so the critics claim that the Federal Reserve is this sinister private organization that has violated the Constitution and is taking control of our money. Well, technically, the U.S. Mint is a government agency that prints our money. The Federal Reserve simply buys currency from the mint, and Congress does have authority over the Federal Reserve. It's just that Congress has decided not to directly manage our national money supply, which might actually be a good thing. So the Constitution is really not being violated here. But the other criticism is more ideological. The fact that the Federal Reserve, the bankers, have secured for themselves the right to print money that's not backed by anything. I mean, if we printed money in our basement, we would all go to jail. But here are men in an industry, the banking industry, that are given the right to print money and also the right to fractional lending. They can loan out up to 10 times more than they have in deposits. And so the idea here is that these bankers can just sit back in an easy chair and watch the profits roll in, and that sounds quite unfair. There is a very popular video demonizing the Federal Reserve. It's called The Money Masters. You can see it on YouTube. It came out in like 1995, 1996, and it's about 2.5 hours long. So you have to have a pretty strong constitution to sit through it. But just to get a sense of the gripe here are some quotes from the video. From Charles Lindbergh, congressman from 1907 to 1917, the financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers the finance system by authority of a purely profiteering group. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. And it was in 1917 that Congressman Lindbergh presented articles of impeachment against the Board of the Federal Reserve, charging they were involved in conspiracy in violation of the Constitution. Also, Congressman McFadden of Pennsylvania, 1915 to 1935. We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. Wow, that's quite the claim. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board. This evil institution has impoverished the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the money vultures who control it. Then Barry Goldwater, senator through the 50s up to the 70s. Most Americans have no real understanding of the operation of the international money lenders. The accounts of the Federal Reserve System have never been audited. It operates outside the control of Congress and manipulates the credit of the United States. Now, bear in mind that many of these critics of the Federal Reserve have their quirks. McFadden was anti-Jew. He believed that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a real document describing how the Jews were going to take over the world. He formed an organization called the Independent Republican National Christian Gentile Committee. Barry Goldwater, he was an opponent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He was pro-abortion, and he despised the evangelical religious right. Congressman Lindbergh also held some unusual views. Now, conspiracy theorists would say that's exactly what the bankers want you to think. They want you to think that their critics are screwballs, when in fact they're actually the righteous few fighting against the powerful rich. Well, it really can be difficult to discern who is right and who's wrong. I mean, some people fight true conspiracies out of true justice and knowledge, and there are others who are driven by class envy and a limited knowledge of how this world works. Just because somebody makes money from something doesn't mean it's evil. I mean, look at farmers. They put a seed in the ground, and they can produce 100-fold from one seed. And so somebody can claim, look, they're able to produce something out of nothing. And everyone works for a profit. Everyone wants to maximize their profits. That doesn't make you a vulture. Remember Isaiah chapter 8? 8:12. You are not to say it is a conspiracy in regard to all that this people call a conspiracy. And you're not to fear what they fear or be in dread of it. Now, at this time, certain Jews thought that the prophet Isaiah must be working under the table for the Assyrians because Isaiah was counseling Judah not to join an alliance to fight Assyria. Therefore, Isaiah must be working for the Assyrians. And conspiracy theorists look at who or what a policy might favor, and then they work backwards. So congressmen who supported the Federal Reserve must be working for the bankers, or the weapon manufacturers and the banks must have started World War I and World War II because they benefited from those wars. Now, I'm not saying that's true or false, but this logic can often lead to wrong conclusions. And with that logic, anyone can be declared guilty. Even Jesus was accused of having an agenda that he didn't have. The mind of the conspiracy theorist can be a very complicated thing. You know, it's best described as those puzzles where you connect the dots, where you connect point 1 to point 2 to point 3, point 4, and then you get this picture. But what if someone connected point 1 to point 8 to point 3 to point 12? They would get a completely different picture. Well, there are some people who connect the dots logically, and there are other people, because of limited knowledge, because of certain biases and beliefs, connect the dots differently. And this really does illustrate why there are promoters and opponents of conspiracy theories in all sorts of aspects of this world. Now, of course, we should have legitimate concern about bankers and money changers. All industries, financial or otherwise, can create monopolies. And our American founders were very concerned that America would not fall into the same monetary system as the old European feudal overlord system. Thomas Jefferson wrote this: "I sincerely believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." He wanted privatization in banking and money. James Madison: "History records that money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over money and its issuance." And if you know anything about American history, this is one of the biggest arguments in early American politics. Central banks or no central banks. Presidential campaigns were won or lost over this particular issue. And if you remember your American history, in 1791, Congress created the first central bank for the United States. It didn't last. Then they tried again in 1816, and that didn't last. Alexander Hamilton wanted a central bank. Jefferson and Madison were against the big banks, thinking that they were tools of swindlers and thieves. Now, one of the overall ethical issues that needs to first be decided is whether charging interest is right or wrong. That's one of the ethical issues that gets mixed into this whole argument against the Federal Reserve and bankers. In the Middle Ages, the church attempted to ban lay people from charging interest. But later on, many reformers began to teach that the charging of interest, charging the legitimate cost of using money, did not constitute the sin of usury. The sin was not in charging interest, but the sin was in excessive profits. They were saying that lending money is legitimate, that borrowed money is needful to businesses to acquire assets to produce more wealth. And so even the Roman Catholic Church changed its policy in the 19th century, Remember Jesus in the parable of the talents? Jesus has the master saying to his lazy servant, Matthew 25:27, "Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest." So it appears as if Jesus is condoning interest rather than just sitting in the bank. Money can be invested or put to work. At issue is all of these Old Testament commands prohibiting the Jews from charging interest of their fellow countrymen. Quite a few verses here. Exodus 22:25. "If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest." Leviticus 25:36. "Do not take usurious interest from him, but revere your God, that your countrymen may live with you. You shall not give him your silver at interest, nor your food for gain." Deuteronomy 23:19. "You shall not charge interest to your countrymen, interest on money, food, or anything that may be loaned at interest." Deuteronomy 23:20. "You may charge interest to a foreigner, but to your countrymen you shall not charge interest, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land which you are about to enter to possess." Nehemiah 5:7. "I consulted with myself and contended with the nobles and the rulers and said to them, you are exacting usury, each from his brother. Therefore I held a great assembly against them." Nehemiah 5:10. "And likewise I, my brothers, and my servants are lending them money and grain. Please let us leave off this usury." And then Psalm 15:5. "He does not put out his money at interest, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be shaken." Proverbs 28:8. "He who increases his wealth by interest and usury gathers it for him who is gracious to the poor." Ezekiel 18:13. "He lends money on interest and takes increase. Will he live? He will not live. He has committed all of these abominations. He will surely be put to death. His blood will be upon his own head." And then concerning the righteous, in Ezekiel 18:17, "He keeps his hand from the poor. He does not take interest or increase, but executes my ordinances and walks in my statutes. He will not die for his father's iniquity. He will surely live." And one last verse, Jeremiah 15:10. "Woe to me, my mother, that you have bore me as a man of strife and a man of contention to all the land. I have not lent, nor have men lent money to me. Yet everyone curses me." So Jeremiah was saying, I wasn't even a banker, and I was still cursed. So bankers have never had a good reputation because in most cases, the interest charged was excessive, and it unduly enriched the banker. Now, the question surrounds the Hebrew meaning of this word interest or usury. In Hebrew, the word is actually to bite. And the Hebrew language was a simple agricultural language. And they used many natural metaphors. And so when they were looking around for a word to describe this metaphysical concept of interest and usury, they used this word to bite, or to bite off a portion. And not much has changed because we use the same metaphor today. Somebody might say, the federal government really takes a bite out of my paycheck. So the question is whether this was condemning all interest or just excessive interest. Interest that bites. Interest that's hurtful. Because if you lend money, it's not free to you. It costs you something. You have the risk of losing it, and there are all sorts of things that you could do with your own money. You can invest it in a cow, or a farm, or a plow. So money has a cost, just like any other product. You can't give it out for free, otherwise eventually you're going to become bankrupt. So lending money appears to be a legitimate business. Now this is where it can get very complicated, because even though the opponents of the Federal Reserve might agree that charging interest is not a sin, their complaint is that the banks have a monopoly They have the power to get money created out of nothing from the Federal Reserve at a low interest rate and then turn it around and charge the public a high interest rate. If only we could do that. Well, you can, actually. You can start your own bank or credit union or some other financial institution. But the basic problem with the founding of America, in the founding of America, we had a completely deregulated private banking system. Any organization or bank could create its own money. And there were 30,000 different types of currency in America because currency or money is simply promissory notes, IOUs. Don't think of money as being wealth. Think of money as the medium of exchange for wealth. For example, let's say I wanted to buy a book. And so I said, listen, I want to buy this book. So what I'll do is I'll exchange with you this book. And so we could have a society where we all barter. But instead, because that's so cumbersome, we say, okay, we're going to use these tickets called promissory notes, dollar bills. And so you give me $1, I give you the book, then I can take the $1, and then I can go buy the other book that I want. And that's the way the system works. Money is simply promissory notes promising certain future goods and services. And in a sense, all money is created out of thin air. Whenever you write a check backed by some asset, you are creating money out of thin air. You are creating a medium of exchange out of thin air. You're not creating wealth, you're creating a medium of exchange. Now, you can tie that promissory note to gold or to silver or to barrels of oil or to pork belly futures. But that doesn't make it that much more secure. I did a program a while back about this, about the gold standard. It must have been like 4 years ago I did this. It's program number 127. Go to the God and Country website and go down to program 127, and it explains really the pros and cons of the gold standard. But many of those who are objecting to the Federal Reserve do so because the Federal Reserve has taken us off the gold standard. So there are really two issues being mixed together here in condemning the Federal Reserve. The issue of this private organization managing the currency and the issue of the gold standard. And you really can't properly discuss this whole issue without separating those two issues. Now, some would be for the Federal Reserve as long as it would go back on the gold standard. Others, like that documentary, Money Matters, they're both against the Federal Reserve and against the gold standard. Their contention is what we need to do is have Congress print money directly and not use the Federal Reserve organization. Just like Abraham Lincoln did during the Civil War, Lincoln had Congress print money called greenbacks. If you notice in the slide here, the currency says United States of America, while our current currency says Federal Reserve note. Our currency is created by this private entity called the Federal Reserve, which is under the watch of Congress. Why? Well, back in 1913, the banking system was a mess. Congress wasn't doing its job. Congress didn't even know enough about money and currency to control the economy. Everyone was doing that which was right in his own eyes, as in the days of the Judges chapter 21, verse 23. And so because of this, there were many economic downturns in America. The Panic of 1857, of 1873, the Panic of 1893, of 1896, 1907, and 1910. And so Congress realized that something needs to be done. They were not doing a very good job of controlling the money supply, and complete privatization was not working either. And so a group of bankers came up with this plan for the Federal Reserve. Now, is that a problem? I mean, who do you want to come up with the plan? Farmers? Lawyers? Politicians? College intellectuals? The fact that the bankers came up with the plan is not necessarily a bad thing. We want experts to come up with the plan. And one of the demonizations of the Federal Reserve comes from the fact that the original plan for the Federal Reserve was created by a group of bankers meeting on a secluded private island off of the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island. And that definitely sounds sinister. And of course, the critics call this a secret meeting, as if no other business meeting is private. But Congress still had to vote on the proposal put together by these bankers. So they came up with a privatized system that had government oversight, more oversight than before. And rather than having Congress print and distribute money, the people themselves would take care of their own business. Congress, with its political motivations, was not to have a direct hand on printing money. And it's funny how conservatives are all about privatization, and I'm for privatization and getting the government out of business, but for some, not when it comes to the Federal Reserve. I'm almost certain if the Federal Reserve never existed, and Congress was now in control of the money supply, the very same people who are demonizing the Federal Reserve would be crying out that we would establish a Federal Reserve, saying that the problems are all due to Congress's control of our money supply, and if we could just get it privatized and create a Federal Reserve, all would be well. But the same problems we have with the Federal Reserve today, we would still likely have if Congress directly controlled the money supply, and probably even worse. Congress would be lending it out to banks at the prime rate, and the banks would still have fractional lending rights, except these career bureaucrats and congressmen often have no idea what they're doing, and they're often motivated by political ends. If Congress directly controlled the money supply, we probably would have 100% inflation like some of these banana republics in South America, because Congress wouldn't need to borrow money. Congress would just print all the money they needed for current expenses. And when has government ever said they have enough money? The Federal Reserve, although it's under congressional oversight, is a check on government and banks. The Federal Reserve requires the government to show proper expenditures, proper balances. It handles the payments of the federal government. It audits member banks. It requires banks to meet certain holdings and lending standards. It handles bank transfers. The system of exchange necessary to do business is a huge undertaking. And when we get a paycheck, we often don't realize all that's behind the task of creating and maintaining a monetary system. And one of the reasons the United States has been so successful economically, and one of the reasons the U.S. dollar is the de facto world currency, is because it's controlled by regulators, the Federal Reserve. And unless people have a confidence in their money system, they're not going to bother to build or produce anything, and such is the case in many countries of the world. Corrupt and unfair monetary policies keep people poor and unmotivated, and there are a lot of countries that only wish they could have a Federal Reserve. Instead, they're subject to the whims of politicians and dictators. So let me just conclude with a couple of biblical precepts here. First, be careful not to use scapegoats for other problems. Don't make the Federal Reserve the scapegoat for other national sins, which are the real source of our troubles. One video claimed that the doing away with the Federal Reserve will be the solution to all of America's economic problems. I don't think so. For example, remember the party of the zealots in Jesus' day? They were convinced that the Roman government was the boogeyman, that the Roman government was the source of all of Israel's woes. If they just threw off the Roman government, everything would be wonderful. But in fact, the Roman government was the institution established by God to hold the society together, acting as a brake on even worse evils that would break out from the hearts of the people. So the zealots blamed the wrong thing. And hence, Israel was completely destroyed when they sought to deliver themselves from the current system. As Jesus said, they did not know the way of peace. Second, don't begrudge others in their work or in their pay out of envy or some misguided sense of economic justice. Whenever we hear about bankers living off of just shuffling money, it's easy to get perturbed. We all understand this because we have to work by the sweat of our brow. We have to produce something. And then along comes these financiers who live off of taking money from the government and then lending it out at interest. What a racket. Even Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple. But consider, if the operation of our monetary system by bankers drained 15% of every dollar we earned, it would be well worth it. If we didn't have a banking and monetary system, we couldn't do any business. Not very easily, anyway. Go live in a third world country for a little while, and you will gladly pay an extra 15% just to have a sound currency system and a currency that works. In fact, the Commerce Department states that the entire financial sector in America, that's Wall Street, that's all the banks, everybody in the mortgage business, the entire financial sector in America accounts for only 8.4% of the United States gross domestic product. And that is a commission that's well worth paying. And so what if bankers and brokers have a profit motive? And so what if the bankers who created the Federal Reserve had a profit motive? We don't expect people to work for nothing, do we? If they weren't making money off of doing their job, they wouldn't be doing their job. The same goes for the army, the police, the doctors. So don't begrudge people who are making a living off of you by providing you a service. People should be able to profit off of you. Remember that quote earlier from Charles Lindbergh, the congressman? The financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers the finance system by the authority of a purely profiteering group. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits. Well, that sounds like the ideology of communism. Profits should not be considered unjust. And don't assume that all profits are wrong or based upon greed. Did you know that the Federal Reserve is actually a nonprofit organization? It gives all of its earnings or its revenue back to the government. And the governors on the board of the Federal Reserve have their salaries set between $150,000 and $200,000 a year. Good for them. They're educated professionals. If you want to make that much money, it's easy. Just start a business and provide goods and services for people. Me personally, I'm not interested in being here for money. My reward is spiritual, but I don't begrudge others who have a calling to make money. Do you know Erastus? Romans chapter 16, verse 23. He was a Christian, and he was the city treasurer of Corinth. And he probably made a good salary. His job was an important function. It was a calling from God. Remember the character Nabal. His name means fool. David sent his men to Nabal to receive a donation from Nabal. 1 Samuel chapter 25:8. Please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David. Now, this might seem like a shakedown, but David's men were the de facto police force protecting the region from marauders. And without David's protection, Nabal probably couldn't run his farm business in the valley. And it was customary for the businesses in the area to appreciate and to support the work of these Jewish militias, David's work. But what did Nabal say? Who is David? Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men who I do not know? So what was Nabal's problem here? He was a man who was stingy. He didn't think others should make a living off of him. He didn't appreciate the service of others. He didn't see the need. So let's not be like the Nabals of the world. Let's not be critics of the very institutions and the people who work for us economically, socially, or militarily. Don't begrudge the work of others. Remember the Pharisees when they tried to trip up Jesus, asking him whether it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Jesus said, "Show me a coin. Whose image is on it?" Caesar's. "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Now think about this from an economic point of view. The Jews were using Caesar's monetary system. And they were actually benefiting from Caesar's monetary system. The Jews didn't even have to pay for their own standing army because the Roman government took care of their protection. And the Jews could do business through the Roman Empire because Rome regulated a common currency. So there's a fair price to be paid. Now, what about the mistakes that the Federal Reserve has made throughout history, throughout the 20th century? The gradual inflation that the Fed has built into our economy. It was actually the Fed's foolish policy that caused a crash in 1929 and the ensuing depression. The Feds caused the recession in the 1970s. And the Fed was responsible for the subprime mortgage crisis in 2009. All because the Fed made money too cheap, created a bubble, and then tightened the currency. But does this mean that the Federal Reserve was the problem? No, the problem was ignorant monetary policy. But again, if we had a different system, if Congress was in control, we could still have ignorant monetary policy, maybe even worse. But just because there's bad policy doesn't necessarily mean we need to overturn the entire system. Congress makes mistakes. Does that mean we should do away with Congress? When we see errors, it's not necessarily the whole system that's to be blamed. Rather than overturning the whole system, it's a more reasonable approach to lobby to fix the specific problems. Because bankers do have a monopoly over lending U.S. money, maybe their profits should be regulated like we regulate the profits of utilities. I mean, I have just as much concern over Goldman Sachs bonuses that are just incredibly high. I have as much concern over those as the next guy. Something doesn't seem kosher. Here's an interesting verse to keep in mind when you see imperfections in government. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8. If you see oppression of the poor and the denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight. For one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. There's a lot in this verse, but the bottom line is that anyone who makes obscene profits will eventually get his comeuppance. Evil people put checks and balances on other evil people. And second, this verse is teaching, if there are some economic injustices, overall, good things can still be built. Even a despotic king cultivates the field, and people get fed. Even with the Federal Reserve System, for all of its faults, America became the richest nation in the world. Now, this is not to say we shouldn't point out economic injustices, but when we see it, as the verse says, don't be so alarmed. Don't become a conspiracy nut. Discern the difference between normal problems in any system versus serious crimes. Remember, it's always the communists and the anarchists who always exaggerated the problems in a free society in order to get followers, in order to promote change to destroy the system. Notice also that the New Testament doesn't give us any examples of the apostles making a big fuss over the Roman economic system or Roman economic policy. Now, we can, of course, teach biblical economic principles, but our number one focus needs to be to change the hearts of individuals through the gospel, and that will create a moral basis in society that will be the basis for good economic policy. Because the problem is more about the people running the system than the system itself. Finally, let me say this. As I said at the beginning, I believe most of the frustration with the Federal Reserve System comes from a frustration with the nature of money itself, the transient nature of this world. Regardless of whether our money is run by Congress or the Federal Reserve or by private bankers, intrinsically there is no security in money. And people are looking for security. Some hope there will be more security if we don't have a Federal Reserve, but don't kid yourself. You're not going to get more security. You can work your entire life, and everything that you have worked for is zeros and ones in some computer hard drive, and it could be erased in a moment. So you say, well, then I'm going to invest in gold. Well, do you think a piece of yellow metal has value? In 2009, gold was worth $1,800. Now it's worth $1,350. Tomorrow it could be worth $10. Revelation chapter 6, a quart of wheat for a denarius. In other words, 1 day's wage for one meal. You think gold is going to be more valuable than bread when the apocalypse starts? I don't think so. People are so much like the rich fool in Luke chapter 12 who said, I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? See, people are trying to find security and wealth in this world. But nothing in this world has intrinsic values. Nothing in this world is eternal. The Federal Reserve is not the problem. The monetary system is not the problem. The problem is that this world is passing away. But as that verse goes on to say, he who does the will of God abides forever. And what's the will of God? Receiving the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. As Jesus described it in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, don't store up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. So put your hope, your future, your energy, your investment in the Lord Jesus Christ and in the kingdom of Christ, because he's our rock, he's our fortress, he's our deliverer. Thank you for making God and country a part of your discipleship in the Word. I'll be traveling a few days this week, so I hope I can put together another YouTube for next week. If I can, it's going to be observations about the culture war. But until next time, Keep living by the word of the Lord. May God richly bless.